Welcome to And Yet, Augustana's online adult education. And this is calling part 2 of our series. And if you remember correctly, this is from Vibrant Faith, and it is a visual curriculum called Calling Now. And we've been taking a look at how it is that God calls us. And again, many times it's being called into things in our everyday life or ways of moving through our lives, not only little things, but also some of the big things. This first one is on bridges.
I grew up in Pittsburgh, a city with 446 bridges. Not everyone can build bridges, but anyone can cross them. God calls Christians to cross bridges. Jesus cared deeply about crossing bridges and called people to these short but difficult journeys. He called people to cross bridges that connected Jews with Samaritans, men with women, adults with children, the rich with the poor, those included with those who were excluded. And as a matter of faith, Jesus himself is a bridge connecting God with humanity. Bridge traveling was in Jesus' blood. His ancestors did the same. Ruth, the Moabite great-grandmother of King David, was called to cross the bridge between Israel and Moab. Because of her deep love and affection for her Israelite mother-in-law Naomi, she left the comfort of her home in Moab and traveled with Naomi to live in Israel. The story does not indicate that Moab was somehow inferior to Israel, or that Ruth was choosing a greater group over a lesser group. Ruth chose Israel over her Moabite home because she loved Naomi. Love compelled her to follow the call across that bridge. Real human love was the bridge for Ruth. I grew up in a Christian denomination. My family faithfully and lovingly taught me the beliefs and traditions of our church. I became immersed in it and eventually devoted my life's work to my church. But over time, something like a small voice grew louder and louder in my heart. It said, "I call you to cross bridges, to seek out and celebrate love wherever it shows up." Like Ruth, I moved beyond my familial world. I had fallen in love with people from different worlds. Love was the bridge that beckoned me to cross over into new relationships where God's work could be done in ways I hadn't imagined before. Some bridges took me to other Christians, some to Jews and Muslims and Hindus. Surprisingly, some even took me to people who profess no religion at all. I discovered that in each of these places, love abides. And where love abides, so too does God. Following my calling to new relationships has given me a glimpse of God's many faces, a glimpse of expanding love in diverse human expressions. Ruth's crossing taught me that God is neither Moabite nor Israelite. God is the ever-calling love that bridges the divide.
I chose this video because I thought it did an excellent job of taking a look at God is love. And for those of you that did the book study on fierce love, there's many theologians that are taking a look at that face of God can even be in people that we would see as godless, people that are different, people that have different religions. And the fact is if you really do believe that God has created everything and that there is a divine presence in absolutely everything and everyone, God will always be there. The other interesting thing about this video was its talk about bridges and what it is that God calls us to, often beyond those bridges. So if you take a look at that, calling oftentimes changes over a lifetime. It's very easy to see if you've lived a number of decades that your calling was different when you were younger, maybe when your families were younger, than they may be now at this time in your age. But bridges themselves have many functions, and bridges permeate barriers. So as you take a look at what kind of bridge God is calling you to cross, does it permeate some barrier? They also cross boundaries where things connect when they normally wouldn't connect before. They also transcend. And they allow us to cross over big things, bodies of water, different spaces and places, and they provide pathways for trains and for automobiles. Bridges call us to cross. The question is, what bridge is God calling you to cross right now? Love calls us to cross bridges. Love calls us to care. Love calls us to comfort. Love calls us to community. Love calls us home. Love calls us to go beyond the lines and boundaries and barriers that have been drawn for us. Love calls us to forgive. Love calls us to reconcile. Love calls us. Now, let's make that personal. What happens if we change the word God to love and us to me? God calls me to cross bridges. God calls me to care. God calls me to comfort. God calls me to community. God calls me home. God calls me to go beyond the lines, boundaries, and barriers that have been drawn for me. God calls me to forgive. God calls me to reconcile. God calls me. Again, what and where is God calling you? This past Sunday morning, we were with Caroline Lewis, and at the end of her talk, she was talking about what a great gift it is to be able to come back together and worship at Augustana, what it is to come back and be part of adult forum and educational and faith formation. And the way she said it really, it brought tears to my eyes. And I was really hoping she'd talk a little while longer because I wasn't sure I was going to be able to get up and close the session. Afterwards, one of the members called me up and said, I was brought to tears. She said, I realized that, yes, I was still connected, with worshiping online and watching a ton of different worship services and doing all that during COVID and everything else. But what I missed was community. And I did not realize I missed it that much. I wasn't really sure. Many people aren't really sure that they will come back or want to come back. But sometimes God calls us in ways that we don't realize that we really need as much. And so calling me to community really kind of hit my heart. So as you look at those, where is it? Where is it that you felt that kind of ping or gut reaction to what was going on as far as where God and love is calling you? Love called Ruth over a physical bridge from the boundaries of Moab and the borders of Israel. Love called her to a deeper relationship with Naomi. Love called her from. God called her to. And God called her through. If you take a look at this bridge, I'm kind of afraid of heights. This one kind of makes my stomach roll. Bridges sometimes can be calling you to things that seem very frightening. The change seems scary, and you really cannot see what's at the end of the bridge. But bridges are then for seekers. They're for wanderers. They're for adventurers. Also revolutionaries. Change makers. Followers. And not all who wander are lost. Some are answering the call to cross. Caroline Lewis talked on Sunday about the road to Emmaus and how Emmaus isn't a place. One place it mentions it's a village, but what's a village? It's kind of a path to nowhere. And as you kind of looked at that scripture reading, you realize it isn't the destination that is most important. It's the process. It's the getting there. It's the learning. It's the realization. And maybe when we're asked to cross bridges, we may not know that destination. And maybe that destination isn't the main point. So when you look at bridges, like Jim in the video, love calls us to cross bridges to move outside of our comfort zones, from sedentary to seeking. And bridges connect us to the transcendent power of love and relationship. So let's take a look a little bit at how bridges may play out in your life. In the past year, or even the past 2 years of COVID, what bridges have you crossed? And what bridges have you passed by? And in the kingdom of God, we are invited to leave the well-worn path and risk entering into adventure. Adventure is change. What adventure in your life help you embrace a new direction? It could be a way of changing how you think. It could be a way of changing how you behave. It could be a way of even how you're choosing to live your life. Many people are taking huge risks in their lives right now with taking different careers or retiring or traveling different things or relating to families in different ways. What are those bridges that you have crossed? And then finally, when have you crossed a bridge the way that Jim did? And what happened? Jim totally took a different look at where God was in his life. Has that ever happened to you? Have you ever looked at things very, very differently and it really changed your life? Take some time. You can go ahead and stop the video right now and just take some time to look at these. How is it that these things these bridges that you've had to cross or the ones that you chose not to cross? How has that has affected your life? This next one is a wonderful example of being captured.
Everything changed for me in a crowded atrium at a megachurch in the Midwest when I was far from home and assaulted by a sadness I'd never known before. 15 years ago, I was leading a 2-hour session for ministry leaders at a large conference. I was experimenting with these leaders on an approach to ministry that focuses everything we do on a deepening relational attachment to Jesus. It's a Jesus-only way of living and leading instead of a Jesus plus way of living and leading. I mean, plus self-help, or plus the American dream, or plus social media, or plus family values, or plus sexual fulfillment, or plus year-round sports leagues. I called this approach Jesus-centered. And for years, I've been helping people learn what I might call the tips and techniques of ministry leadership, but I'd felt a growing emptiness with all of that. I realized that my own freedom from captivity had nothing to do with tips and techniques. I'd experienced transformation through a deepening relationship with and a dependence on the person of Jesus, not by trying harder to be a better Christian. And in that room full of ministry leaders that day, the room crackled with a kind of electricity. They'd come for training, but together we'd moved into a closer orbit around the most magnetic person in the universe. We were crying and laughing and hungry for more Jesus. So when I emerged from this experience, my appetite for knowing Jesus more deeply was voracious. I popped into as many workshops and general sessions as I could cram in. I listened to the best ministry experts in the country that day. But by the end of the day, I felt, well, deeply sad. The perfectly reasonable tips and techniques of the conventional Christian life had deadened my soul. I sank into an overstuffed chair to pray, and I pleaded with Jesus. Why am I feeling this way? Tears were streaming down my cheeks, and then the voice of Jesus was clear in my head. You're bored by everything but me now. I knew this was the truth as soon as I heard it. My eyes brightened, and the weight I felt on my shoulders was suddenly gone. The try harder to get better strategies for spiritual growth that I've been working on my whole adult life now seemed like annoying background noise. I'd always defined discipleship or faith formation like doing well in school, studying hard, growing in knowledge, doing well on tests. But those things now paled in comparison to the undeniable truth. True disciples, people who follow Jesus and live out his mission, are captured and carried away by him. And when we give our life to him, we find our life. We find our calling. I have a friend who once told me this life-changing progression. Get to know Jesus well, because the more you know him, the more you'll love him. And the more you love him, the more you'll want to follow him. And the more you follow him, the more you'll become like him. And the more you become like him, the more you become yourself.
Being captured. This video brought up a number of things in my mind. Thinking about my faith journey, the struggles that I've had with Jesus and what it means to worship Jesus, and is there a difference between worshiping Jesus and following Jesus, and exactly what it is that I am following with Jesus. When the living, breathing Jesus is the center of everything in our lives, fruit happens. But what does that mean? Augustana says that Worshiping Jesus is the main thing. We talk about that. But what does that mean? Does that mean that we just worship on Sunday mornings? That mean that we take a look at Jesus and see him as awesome and as God's son? Or does it mean something more? When is it that there's that connection with Jesus that lets that fruit happen? That's just the way things work. We discover that we love what God loves, and good things grow in our soul. Now, are we talking about a difference here between experiencing and right brain kind of gut feeling and connecting with Jesus more than the left brain of here's what you do? You go to church on Sunday morning, you do some Bible studies, you volunteer, you do this? Is that what the person in the video was talking about? All the tips and techniques, all the things you do to get people to come together and to do that? Are we talking about something totally different? And out of that kind of abundance, we can give to others much more generously. So we don't have to spend all our energy trying to produce that fruit any more than a shriveled, neglected tree that's dying from thirst. And it has to work to produce fruit once it's been watered and it's fertilized. Where is it that that water and that fertilization comes from us so that that type of fruit can happen for us? We live out our calling in life organically, not through striving. We think about things being grassroots, organic. To me, that's where the passion is. And that passion, as we talked about how we function as humans, is very, very much more right brain than left brain. Jesus promised living water for a reason. He knows we are created by God to live fruitful, purposeful lives. But we can't grow a thing if we don't know how to abide in him. I think that maybe is the difference between good works and actually following and doing a ministry in Jesus. Abiding in him means drinking deeply from his well of living water. And that water is like Miracle Grow for our God-given identity. Abiding in him. A little bit like the last videos we did talking about beholding. There's more to that word than a word. It is a felt sense as well. When Jesus becomes the consuming focus of our worship, we taste true freedom and purpose for the first time. Becomes the consuming focus of our worship. Our burgeoning love for God helps us clearly understand his calling in our life, because worship has cleared away the fog. That's when Jesus' life and energy flows through us, transforming our life into a movable feast that nourishes the hungry people who enter our orbit. I don't think I'm understanding worship here. Because often when we think of worship, we think, or at least I do, of going to church on Sunday mornings. You have the liturgy, you have a sermon, you have music, you have all of that. And isn't that worship? So if we go to church and we worship, is that following Jesus? Is it part of it? Yeah, I think it is. Is that all it is? I get hung up on the word worship because I think I'm seeing oftentimes worship is way too narrow. It's put in a box in a certain way, and I think it could be more. So I started to do a little research, looked up some stuff on the internet. Here's some of the things that I found, and this was one that was based on Isaiah 6. Worship is wonderment. When Isaiah meets God, Isaiah is awestruck by God. He finds wonder beyond his comprehension. When you have wonder, you don't have answers. When you have wonder, you have awe. When you have wonder, you have passion. You delight in that. Worship is also transformative. When Isaiah sees who he really is, which is a sinner, he sees that, yet God transforms him into the person God desires him to be through God's forgiveness. So, how is it that a relationship with Jesus, worshiping Jesus, is transformation in your life? How is it that it transforms who you are? Worship is also renewing. Isaiah is now a renewed person, a different person who lives for the purpose and the will of God. Now, I'm not real sure that as great and as much as we need to worship together as a community on Sunday mornings, that it is enough. I think following Jesus means that you get that sense of renewal, maybe every single day, so that you do see that there's a calling and a purpose and a will of God for you on your daily life. And then worship is also decentering. I thought that one was really interesting. Isaiah is decentered from himself and centered on God's will and purpose for his life. When is it that we take us out of the center of the equation? When is it that God, that Jesus, becomes actually the true center? You know, I don't remember too many times that Jesus asked us to worship him. What I have read more often is him asking us to follow him. I think there is a difference. And then one of the resources said that our biggest problem in realizing this kind of a truly worshipful life, this kind of changing that sense of worship, is that we are too self-centered and we are too self-absorbed. It's how is it that it affects us? I still struggle with the term worship. And I hope that as I grow in my faith, I'm going to be able to have a better sense of that and what that really feels like and means for me. Because I think it is also something that's very individualistic. What worship and following Jesus may mean and what that calling may mean for me, I think is going to be different than it is for you. So here are some questions to take a look at this captured. When have you, like Rick in the video, felt called into a deeper relationship with God? And what is it that led to that? Did you just get to a point in your life when you, like Rick, got bored with the same old stuff? And you knew there was something more out there? You knew there was a bridge to cross that could get you closer to a relationship with God and Jesus that you had not felt? Or was it because there was a traumatic experience that you ended up having to look at, to deal with, and wanted a closer relationship with God? And then, you don't have to use just one sentence. As you can tell from me, I can't get too much out in just one sentence. But what does following Jesus mean to you? What does it really mean to you to follow Jesus? Not to worship Jesus, but to follow Jesus. And then what impact, good or bad, has striving or the tips and techniques of faith had in your faith growth and development? All right. My guess is there's probably some pros and some cons to that. And what fruit in your life has appeared as you've grown closer to Jesus? What things have you found? What fruit has been there? Do you transmit a greater sense of peace? Do you feel more peaceful? What is it that has appeared as you've grown closer? Does it mean that you're more willing to be vulnerable? Does it mean that you're more willing to to take the risks, to talk about what you're struggling with, what you're trying to know, what you're trying to understand? So what fruit in your life has appeared? And then finally, we did this in Coffee and Conversation, where, and we did this the first video too, I think, where you took a picture and you took a look at it. There's no right or wrong answer. You made up some kind of a story about what that picture was, and then you tied it in to where do you see God? Where do you see God in that picture? Now, for those of us that struggle of getting out of our left brains where things are right and wrong, and we deal with words, you need to be more creative. You need to be more right-brained when you deal with this. You need to have some fun. You need to let go of whether something's right or wrong. My hope is that by doing some of these kinds of exercises, it's going to be easier for you to be able to see God in our everyday world. As I took a look at this picture, and of course, as you know, this is my dear little mini donkey Pal. It is a little girl, so I will call her Pally often. But I took this picture, and what actually had happened was Pal, I don't know, had something in her mouth she did not like. And so she was making faces and spitting that out. For me personally, as I took a look at that picture and what that maybe meant to me, and how God kind of connected with me in that, one of the things that I'm trying to move away from that is so common in our culture is dealing with gossip, and dealing with oftentimes a negative, and the negativity that is in gossip. And you can tell when things change if people are sharing things about people because you know they care and they want help and support for those people, but your gut tells you when that changes and when it just turns into gossip, when it turns into negativity. And this is a real hard thing to get away from, because oftentimes, many times, we find connections in groups, and you can say it's women, but it's not. Men gossip just as much as women do. But you get in, and all of a sudden you can feel where it turns and becomes much more negative. What happens, though, is if you're going to be not a part of that, sometimes you will lose connection with people. And I think that is hard. So I had gotten into a situation where all of a sudden it really did turn to a lot of gossip that didn't feel good. And I kind of involved myself in it. And afterwards I felt like Pal looks. It's like, oh my gosh, Stace, you did it again. Yuck, it has a bad taste in your mouth. And you still did it that way. And then when you take a look at Pal and you take a look at that almost compassion in her eyes, if you've ever looked deeply into a horse or a donkey's eyes, even my llamas, with those big eyes, it's almost like you can swim in them. It's almost like you can see their soul, but there's a sense of love. There's a sense of very unconditional love that's there. And that's where I see God in this picture. That no matter how many times I make the choice and do something that I know that isn't good for me, that isn't good for the rest of the world, that I can spit it out and I can still have that unconditional love from God. God is never going to be as judgmental of me as I am. So play around with it. Have some fun. Take a look at some things that are out there. Have some sense of wonder about where God is showing up in your life and where God is also calling you. And again, where is God even calling you right now? What is God calling you to do today? So that actually concludes this whole seasons of And Yet online adult education. If you are interested in talking about this series on calling, there is a Zoom discussion on April 5th from 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. You just contact me at secardwell@augustana.com, and then I will send you the Zoom invitation, and then we'll be able to talk about that. Again, I want to thank you for being here and thank you for participating in all of the online education. I hope you have found it helpful in many ways, and I actually wish you a very, very good spring and summer season. Thanks.